Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Well, it's time to check in on the Arctic, including security issues and economic development. I'm pleased to have a return appearance by Madeleine Redfern, who is now the Executive Director Northern Branch of Arctic 360, Canada's premier Arctic think tank. Welcome back, Madeleine.
Thank you.
So I guess first question, Arctic 360, maybe tell us a little bit about that and some of the issues you're tracking with that particular think tank.
So Arctic 360 is Canada's only Arctic think tank. We have a majority Indigenous and Northern board members that guide the work. We're looking at, of course, all the issues regarding Arctic development, and primarily with a special focus on how the business sector can help Canada and the North build the needed infrastructure, whether that's also developing a strategy, getting the funding and the financing, recognizing that we're going to need the federal government, provincial and territorial governments, local governments, and Indigenous nations participate in ensuring that we get infrastructure that we need that is not only good for our communities, for civilian purposes, but even more increasingly since the invasion of Ukraine, NORAD modernization, which is also good for defense.
Yeah, so your interlocutors then are all of those groups, Indigenous, local, territorial, provincial, federal.
Absolutely. We do also have academics that are, of course, researching and providing some input there. But more importantly is ensuring that anything about us, without us, is the mantra that many Northerners and Indigenous people say, is that we need to be part of those conversations, and we need to be part of deciding how we're going to build out this infrastructure. And more Indigenous nations and communities want to actually own that infrastructure and ensure that it's what happened in the past during World War II or in the Cold War. A lot of that infrastructure didn't always benefit our communities.
Right.
We've got to do better this time.
Right. So it was kind of like these separate islands doing security work or what have you. It really wasn't part of the community. Is that right?
Often. And so I'm really happy to say that we're hearing, both from the US, but also the Canadian military saying that the type of infrastructure that they need for NORAD modernization is the same type of infrastructures needed in our communities. And whether that is for telecommunications, power, and for transportation. So let's be strategic about it this time. And it can be a win-win-win if we do it right.
So can you give us a little bit more detail then on the security issues that are facing the Arctic right now?
So the Gordon Foundation, which I was a part of, actually did a survey a few years back. And understandably, a lot of those security issues weren't just looking at the military. They were looking at human security, the necessity for water supply that is abundant and safe, housing, environmental security, but equally economic security, and as well, of course, sovereignty and defense. There is an opportunity to see these intersections, aligning, especially, as I said, with NORAD modernization, with the billions of dollars of investment that we're going to see actually happen in our northern regions.
So would you say that from your perspective, that's a broad security mandate? It's not just sort of national security. So are you getting a lot of interest in discussing those broader issues?
We are now having those types of conversations. Everyone recognizes that there is no single level of government or a single, source of funding that is going to build out all the infrastructure that we need, both for our communities and or in the defense sector. So we know that telecommunications is in dire, need and condition for, upgrading. Nunavut is the only region with no subsea or terrestrial fiber connection, and nothing replaces fiber. We're going to see with all domain awareness the need for tremendous amounts of data that defense sector needs, and in order to be able to, be aware of the incursions and the threats that are happening in our region, and to be able to
Madeleine, we're just
respond.
going to take a break. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Madeleine Redfern. She is Executive Director at the Northern Branch of Arctic 360. Madeleine, you were just talking about, and this is really an important point, about the need for data, which is important not only for defense purposes, but has a broader, I'm sure, remit so that it can be helpful in a whole bunch of different projects. So please continue with your thoughts on that.
So in order for the military to get the data that they need, part of it is, of course, going to come from satellites, being able to know what's happening in the air, on the surface, whether that's land or on the water. But we're also going to need infrastructure in the marine environment. We're seeing worldwide how important those subsea cables are playing, as well as the ability to actually have smart cables. Sensors on those cables that get that data. So you know what's happening in your waters, and whether that is ship traffic as more and more climate change and less ice and more vessels come into our waters, but also vessels that may be coming in our waters underneath. So submarines and underwater drones. We need that data, and so we're going to need the infrastructure that supports it. And that is primarily fiber optic, but it's also cable landing stations, digital hubs, internet exchange points. We're going to see the development of AI, artificial intelligence, in our regions. And so we need also the energy that supports that digital infrastructure in order to be able to process all that data and to do it, in real time. So that helps both develop our digital economy and our marine and blue digital economy, but it also helps the defense sector get that data so that they can respond immediately when and if necessary.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts, or what is Arctic 360's thoughts about future energy sources? What are you saying about that?
We need real solutions to replace the base load power that is being generated by our diesel plants. So solar and wind or renewable, energy may help in the smaller applications, but generally speaking, especially in the north, that is not a base load solution. So we need either hydro, when and if hydro is applicable, geothermal, again, where it may be applicable, but more often not, we're seeing more conversations happening about either micro modular reactors or small modular reactors. We need a significant amount of energy in our communities as we're growing. We've got our territorial government announced 3,000 new homes that need to be built. We need that energy also to power up that digital infrastructure, those fiber optic cables and those sensors. So energy is another needed necessity. The Auditor General in their Arctic Security Report referenced the lack of a power or heating infrastructure that's needed even for the Nanisivik Naval Base. Without that, right now, we're going to only see 4 weeks a year of the ability of refueling vessels, and that limits our Arctic patrol. So energy is not something that's only needed for our communities, but also for the defense sector.
So do you expect that there's a lot of talk about small modular reactors, at least in southern Canada here, a lot. Premier Ford of Ontario and I think Premier Moe of Saskatchewan, for instance, have been championing this. Do you see that coming your way anytime soon?
Absolutely. I'm actually a member of the National Indigenous Advisory Council on SMR. So it is Indigenous representation right across the whole country,
Wow.
but recognition that there are over 170 of our Indigenous communities that are diesel dependent and almost 300 where it's partially diesel dependent. So we need to find energy solutions right across the entire country and in the north. So it is something that is being looked into, and comparative analysis is absolutely necessary so that our Indigenous communities can have informed discussions and make informed decisions. But we also know that the resource sector needs an energy solution, if whether it's De Beers near Chidliak, our community diamond mine here, Baffinland, there are going to be, clean energy solutions required for the resource sector. And again, the military want to commit to having, clean energy options as well. So everything needs to be looked at, and I don't think we're going to achieve our goal of net zero without nuclear.
Interesting. We're having a discussion with Madeleine Redfern. She is Executive Director at Northern Branch Arctic 360. This discussion will continue after this break. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Madeleine Redfern, Executive Director at the Northern Branch of Arctic 360. Madeleine, before we turn the topics, you mentioned Russia's war in Ukraine earlier. Love to get a kind of a northern perspective on that. It clearly is driving a lot of defense announcements these days at the Department of National Defense, and obviously a lot of economic turmoil in the world. So how has Russia's war on Ukraine sort of changed the calculus in the far north, in the Arctic?
I think that's affected us in two ways. One is that we've seen a significant increase in cost of living, both with respect to not just the fuel that that we get at the pumps for to put into our vehicles, but it's affecting our heating costs, it's affecting our food costs, and it's making more people living in poverty. But at the same time, we've seen, as I said earlier, significant announcements of billions of dollars, both by the United States and by the government of Canada, to build out new infrastructure in our northern regions. And whether that is the Arctic patrol ships, commitments for finding power and heating solutions, telecommunication solutions, and transportation solutions. So there is synergy available for us, but we need a plan. And right now, we don't have a plan on how we're going to ensure that the investments that we make in our northern regions are going to meet the needs both of our communities and the needs of our military. So, as I said, Ukraine invasion has accelerated the discussions on NORAD modernization.
Now, maybe many Canadians are not aware of this, but of course, it has also accentuated the fact that the Arctic is a theater of competition, and that there's a lot more aggressive activity by Russian, air, fighter jets and other tools available to them, probably drones as well. So, is that something that's talked about in the Arctic?
Absolutely, it is a growing conversation that's happening with our Indigenous organizations and our Indigenous development corporations. Nassituk actually won the NORAD contract worth billions of dollars, and there is money in that to help build Inuit capacity. There is absolutely now discussions amongst our northern regions about how we're going to participate in the NORAD modernization, both with respect to actually bidding on and securing those contracts that build out that infrastructure, but also ensuring that that infrastructure, as I said earlier, actually also supports, the ability to build an economy for our people. We need training, we need jobs, and we need people to, no longer be living in poverty. So we see this as a possibility of building, good security for our national defense purposes, but also helping our local regional community security.
Now, you mentioned earlier, food costs and inflation, which is a perennial problem in the Arctic, of course. Love to get your sense on some of the supply chain crisis issues that are also not only a result of Russia, but also the chaos in China. and so on. So tell us a little bit more about how that's affecting life in the Arctic.
So something even as basic as the length of the runways and the fact that they're not paved limits the type of aircraft that can come into our communities that bring not only our passenger traffic, but also our food. So a lot of that fleet that our Northern Airline has is getting old and aged, and they want to move into a larger, more modern type of aircraft that actually can bring in more food. But we can't do that unless we get the investments to pave our runways or extend our runways. And that's just something as simple and basic as that. Similarly, if the fuel costs go up and we're 100% diesel dependent, then all costs rise, not just the cost of the fuel to heat the buildings, our homes, our businesses, but it has that domino effect of increasing all service costs and all food costs. And so this is why we desperately need to see us get to these transformative investments that are going to make real changes in our northern regions, not just for the next year, but for the future proofing our region for decades.
Right.
Things have changed dramatically.
Right. And we're back here at Boom and Bust with Madeleine Redfern, who's Executive Director at Northern Branch Arctic 360. Madeleine, has there been any talk in the Arctic zone about critical minerals and supply of those as part of these supply chain issues?
Absolutely. It's actually on the upcoming Northern Lights Conference in Ottawa that's scheduled for February. It's coming up more and more as part of the need and necessity for Canada to ensure that Canadian and or friendly foreign investment is actually owning the critical mining resources. So we've seen the government of Canada announce it's no longer supporting Chinese investment in critical minerals. In one real example was actually the Kitikmeot region, where Shandong was looking at buying TMAC. And in the end, De Beers was able to buy it when the Shandong sale did not go through. But but a lot of these critical mineral mines that are in development are going to take up to between 5 to 10 years to develop. Indigenous participation actually can help shorten that. And we need to be looking at ways in which Indigenous nations' equity investments, can accelerate the critical mining development that's needed and necessary.
That's a very good point. So let's talk a little bit more about Inuit and Indigenous collaboration and participation. What sorts of things are happening, and what sorts of things do you want to see happening?
So on the energy front, we're seeing a lot more Indigenous nations actually applying for the government funding, building out those energy infrastructure, whether it is renewable or even discussions now are being had on the SMRs. As an SMR is not going to happen without Indigenous participation and approval. We also, are seeing a growing level of Indigenous and Inuit participation in the resource sector. Beyond just benefit agreements, they're now moving towards discussions on partnership agreements, actually owning a portion of that stake and seeing in some cases government grants or government investments being actually transformed into Indigenous equity to assist Indigenous participation in major projects. So we're seeing it in transportation, in energy, in resource sector, and telecommunications. Indigenous people want to be part of these sectors and build up that capacity and raise our people, to having real economies and not living in poverty.
Now, you're a former mayor of Iqaluit, of course, and I'd love to get your sense in the time we have left. We got just under 2 minutes about northern communities, what's happening at the community level and how they can move forward with local governments and other community organizations.
So we need to see the opportunity of local leaders and local, community members being able to be informed and aware that these really high level international, national discussions, don't forget that these investments need to have our participation, and that, whatever happens, about us, it needs to include us. And so it is exciting times. It's hard work. But if we don't include our local people, then these projects are not going to proceed.
And that's what's happening then, that the locals are being increasingly added to the mix?
There's reminding, all levels of governments that nothing about us without us means include us early, include us frequently. We want to be, part of those discussions. We want to be aware, of what the options are, and that we get to be part of the decision-making process, and we get to be part of the solution, that is good for our communities, but also good for our regional and national and international interests.
Well, that's the key, isn't it? Nothing about us without us. Madeleine, thanks for joining us today. Very interesting discussion. It's great to catch up again. I think it's been over a year since we had a chat about this. I'm a big believer in focusing in on the Arctic. I think it's part of what Canada has to bring to the table. So again, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Once again, that was Madeleine Redfern of Arctic 360, former mayor of Iqaluit in Nunavut territory. Lots of great insight into Arctic development, Arctic security, and Indigenous participation. I hope you enjoyed the show. I'm sure we'll have her back at some point. Thanks for watching.